The Battle of the Atlantic saw the fleets of the Western Allies engaged in a life-or-death struggle to supply the war effort against Nazi Germany in Europe and North Africa. Convoys of ships carrying everything from pencils to fighter planes, protected by flotillas of warships of all sizes, ventured out from North American ports to run the gauntlet laid out by Germany's U-boat fleet. Such was the effectiveness of the U-boats in the early years of the war, and the threat they subsequently posed to the Allied effort, that Churchill would later confess that the U-boats were the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. But even the largest fires start with a single spark. In today's episode, we're going to look at the tragic first shot fired in this pivotal battle that would last the entirety of the war. This is the story of the sinking of the SS Athenia, a ship doomed by mistakes made on both sides of the conflict that would cost the lives of over 100 people, nearly all of whom were simply trying to escape the flames of war. Welcome to Wars of the World. On September 1st, 1939, Germany's Wehrmacht blasted across its eastern border into Poland. After years of appeasing Adolf Hitler's ambitions under the policy of peace at any price, Britain and France viewed this as the final straw and demanded the Germans withdraw or a state of war would exist between them and the combined forces of London and Paris. With the Führer unwilling to order his troops to return home, as he set his people on the path to what he viewed as their destiny, within 48 hours, war was declared on September 3rd, 1939. In London, on the morning of that fateful day, an old force found itself returning to a seat of power after years in exile in the British political wilderness. That force appeared in the portly, bullish form of Winston Spencer Churchill. While the appointment of the 64-year-old to the post was largely welcomed by the fleet, it was not without its controversy. Part of the reason for Churchill's exile was the scathing attacks he had made against his fellow politicians for their lack of action in stopping Hitler sooner. He had also called for strengthening ties with the Soviet Union to box Hitler in, despite being a staunch anti-communist himself. However, these all fell on deaf ears, but no longer, and as a consequence of his powerful personality, the British public had demanded his return to office as war loomed. As Churchill made himself comfortable in his old role, his foe, in the form of the German Navy, were themselves preparing to meet the Royal Navy in battle and wreak havoc upon the British merchant fleets, the lifeblood of the island nation. Almost immediately upon the ultimatum being issued by Britain and France, the Kriegsmarine let loose its force of U-boats to assume patrol stations around the French coast and the British Isles, so that once war was formally declared, they could begin attacks immediately. However, not even Hitler was ready to fully commit to the type of unrestricted submarine warfare that the Kaiser had undertaken during the First World War. Hitler knew that the sinking of the British liner Lusitania on May 7, 1915 was a major factor in the United States joining the war on the Western Front against Imperial Germany. He also hoped that London's desire for peace might still persevere over its desire for war, especially over a country on the other side of the Channel. He therefore clung to the notion that after making a gesture in opposition to his invasion, the government of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain would negotiate for peace, but not if hundreds of their civilians had been killed at sea by U-boats. With this in mind, he gave his U-boat fleet under the command of Admiral Karl Dönitz strict instructions that while smaller warships were fair game, they were not under any circumstances to attack civilian vessels or the Royal Navy's capital ships, knowing that this would antagonize the British. Instead, they were to operate under prize rules, whereby they could stop a British merchant ship, inspect the cargo, and if it was found to be war material, then it could be sunk. Believing that the French were even more weak-minded for war, Hitler initially forbade any attacks on French shipping. As the German blitzkrieg in Poland got underway on the morning of the 1st, there was little time for anyone to properly react to the event or appreciate the scale of what had begun, and so for much of Britain, the day went on as usual, with only the news crackling through radio sets indicating that anything was out of the ordinary. People still went to work, the trains were still running, children were preparing to return to school after their summer holidays, while in Britain's many busy harbours, ships of all sizes from all over the world were either getting ready to dock and unload passengers and goods, or were preparing to set sail to lands far off. One of the latter was Donaldson's line SS Athenia. At 13,465 tons, the Athenia was hardly the biggest ship in Britain's docks, not by a long way off, nor was it the most glamorous. However, it had given its owners, the Donaldson Atlantic Line, nearly 17 years of reliable service on the transatlantic routes, mostly to Canada. With its name, the ship replaced a previous liner built in 1902 for the company, with that Athenia meeting a tragic end when it was sunk by a German U-boat on August 16, 1917. Setting off from Glasgow, the liner first made a stop-off in Belfast and then in Liverpool, before heading out towards the Atlantic around the north coast of Ireland. Under the command of Captain James Cook, the liner had 1,103 passengers on board, including 500 Jewish refugees who had escaped persecution in Nazi Germany and occupied lands. Despite the declaration of war on the 3rd, the vessel was not issued with a recall order, and so was allowed to continue on its course for Montreal. But Captain Cook was not ignorant of the possible danger his ship was in from submarines. He therefore adopted the standard zigzag pattern to make it more difficult for a submarine to aim at them, and as the sun began to set, he ordered the ship's lights to be blacked out. Within eyeshot of the liner, as the day wore on, was the imposing private steam yacht Southern Cross, owned by wealthy Swedish entrepreneur Axel Werner-Gren. The 2,115-ton vessel was lavishly decorated and featured accommodation for up to 14 guests, as well as crew. Originally built in 1930 as the Rover, it was briefly owned by legendary American businessman and aviation pioneer Howard Hughes, who renamed it Southern Cross before selling it to Werner-Gren. Born into a wealthy family already, by 1939 Werner-Gren had a number of successful business ventures under his belt, which had endowed him with many influential contacts amongst Europe's elite, including the Nazi Party. It was perhaps his keen business sense, or possibly his links with the Nazis, that inspired him to set off in his yacht for the Bahamas in August 1939, sensing that war was coming. Indeed, he was one of numerous wealthy Europeans to undertake such impromptu holidays in the last days of peace, sensing that business might become a little more difficult if they remained on the continent. One of the first U-boats to be dispatched out to sea was U-30, under the command of one Fritz Julius Lemp. A Type 7A boat, U-30 was one of the first of a new generation of German U-boats, ordered into production following the Führer's decision to reverse the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which forbade Germany from operating such vessels. Commissioned on October 8, 1936, U-30 was modestly armed with 11 torpedoes and one effective 88mm deck gun for engaging targets on the surface, and had a crew complement of 42 men, all living and working in the cramped confines of a hull that displaced just 626 tons on the surface. The war was barely a few hours old when at 1630 hours on September 3, 1939, Kemp spied the Athenia in the distance as his U-boat cut along the surface, although at that particular time, he had yet to identify the vessel. However, three factors were setting off alarm bells in the U-boat commander's mind that the vessel was a British combatant. Firstly, following the Führer's orders, he had elected to patrol an area that was not in the normal shipping lanes used by passenger vessels, which implied this was not a passenger ship. Secondly, the ship was darkened, meaning it wanted to go unnoticed. And thirdly, it was zigzagging, all of which, to him, implied the vessel was a warship, possibly an armed merchant cruiser. In numerous wars, including the Great War, British passenger liners were often reconstituted as warships, being fitted with deck guns and other weapons, and were often employed on duties such as convoy protection or acting as armed raiders. Working under this assumption, Lemp ordered U-30 to increase speed in order to catch up with the vessel before diving to make a closer inspection of his intended target. Peering through the periscope in the waning hours of light, Lemp struggled to properly identify the ship, which was, by now, sailing 60 miles north of Rockall, a small islet used as a navigation reference, and 200 miles off Innistrahul, the most northerly island considered a part of Ireland. Few of the passengers, or even the crew on board Athenia, could have known that it was while sailing off the latter island that the previous liner sporting their ship's name was sunk by a U-boat in the last war. Based on the evidence as he saw it, Lemp decided that he was looking at an armed merchant cruiser, and so he ordered his men to battle stations to prepare to attack. Ordering 2 torpedo tubes to be flooded, he gave the order to fire at approximately 1940 hours, and the 2 torpedoes went scurrying towards their target. A few moments later, and the submarine boomed with the sound of a single direct hit. Fearing the second torpedo had malfunctioned and would swing back around onto his U-boat, Lemp ordered the crew to dive until he was sure the danger had passed. Above the waters, the Athenia and her passengers and crew were forced to confront the horror of submarine warfare. The torpedo had struck aft on the port side near the engine room, killing 117 people, either from the initial blast or the sudden influx of water from the hole that had been torn into the hull. Despite a fairly effective damage control effort by the crew, it was obvious that the ship was going to sink, albeit rather slowly, as the vessel began to go down backwards. Having seen the blast from his yacht, Axel Werner-Gren immediately changed course and went to assist in an evacuation. Lemp, meanwhile, had surfaced to inspect his handiwork and spied his target in the fading light of the first day of the Battle of the Atlantic through a set of binoculars. Seeing that his target had come to a stop, he was disappointed it was not sinking fast and could even be saved by rescue vessels, so he decided to finish it off while it was a sitting duck. A third torpedo was subsequently spat from the U-30's tubes in the direction of the Athenia, but by some extraordinary miracle, this too malfunctioned and missed the target. Lemp was cursing his luck, but then paused for a moment as he examined his target's silhouette in the moonlight. He then called for the U-boat's copy of the Lloyd's Register of Ships to be brought up to him, and matched the image in the book to what he was seeing. His heart skipped a beat as he began to suspect the worst. His fears were only confirmed when his radio operator reported they were receiving a distress signal from a passenger liner named the Athenia that had been attacked by a submarine. Less than a few hours into the war, Lemp realized he had already violated the Führer's orders and had probably committed a war crime, and so because of this, he delayed reporting the sinking until he could get his story straight. Realizing British warships would likely be responding to the distress signal, he ordered the submarine to slip away, leaving behind a scene of carnage and fear as the passengers and crew began mustering their lifeboat stations, ready to abandon the sinking vessel. It would take nearly 14 hours for the ship to fully sink, no doubt saving hundreds of lives by allowing them time to man the lifeboats. Had Lemp's third torpedo worked as intended, it would likely have sunk far sooner, killing many, many more. Tragically, during the evacuation efforts, a lifeboat attempting to come alongside Werner-Gren's Southern Cross capsized as the weather deteriorated, killing 10 people, while 3 were crushed attempting to transfer from a lifeboat to a Royal Navy destroyer. There was widespread anger following the sinking, and this extended to the Führer himself, since his orders had been disobeyed. Realizing there was little that could be done to rectify the damage by punishing Lemp, instead the Führer's government blamed the British for the sinking, initially for not recalling the liner when war broke out, and then going so far as to accuse Winston Churchill of ordering a British submarine to attack the Athenia, in the hopes of bringing the United States into the war on the side of Britain and France, since 28 of the dead were US citizens. They cited Churchill's prior use of Q-ships in the Great War as proof of his deceptive ways, these being armed warships disguised as merchant ships to lure in unsuspecting German ships and U-boats before firing on them. The German Navy even went as far as to alter the logs of the U-30, although many of those involved in the cover-up later confessed during the Nuremberg trials. Such accusations largely fell on deaf ears, and Nazi Germany was vilified by American newspapers. However, some notable Americans, such as former US President Herbert Hoover, did at least publicly entertain the notion that Britain had much to gain politically from the sinking and the subsequent death of Americans. It did not help the Nazi cover-up that several of the American passengers on board were in the public eye, be they journalists or stars of the stage and screen, who recounted the horror of the sinking once they had been safely returned home. An effort that was undertaken with the help of American diplomat Joseph Kennedy and his son John F. Kennedy, the future 35th US president. Axel Werner-Gren was widely praised for his efforts to rescue passengers from the Athenia. However, in the years since, some questions have been raised about his involvement that night. It was well known that he was connected to members of the Nazi Party, and later, rescued passengers testified that his yacht seemed to be endowed with a great number of radio aerials. This has led to theories that he was somehow involved in the sinking, possibly by radioing Athenia's position to U-30 prior to the attack. However, the German officers questioned after the war make no mention of this. Finally, one notable person scheduled to travel on the Athenia, but who was fortuitously absent when her name was taken off the passenger list at the last minute, was one Carmen Silverer. Only a girl of 17 at the time, she would later earn widespread acclaim and affection amongst British television audiences in the 1980s, portraying Edith, the long-suffering wife of a French restaurant owner in the BBC sitcom Allo Allo, set during the German occupation of France. And there you have the tragic tale that initiated the battle for the Atlantic. Please leave a comment down below with your own thoughts and reactions, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.